We're starting a new series, and with us is JQ. You might see in time that he has his own podcast. But he approached me with an idea which I thought was excellent, and I asked him if he would come on and present a series, which is entitled, and we mentioned this as a teaser at the beginning of Part 3 with Aric the Blacksmith and Phantasms of Freedom, and this series is entitled Poetic Perplexities, Emerging Visions of Global Empire. So JQ, welcome. I think it's a great idea, and I thank you for coming forward with that with me. And I hope I can do you justice because this is pretty deep stuff.
Well, thanks for having me. I think we're both going to have a lot of fun with this topic and explore some interesting new territory, possibly, or forgotten history. So.
Yeah, they're one and the same. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's a frontier that we've left very far behind us because of the history that's been suppressed, forgotten about, and probably deliberately so. But let me ask you this. I mean, it's pretty provocative that you would say emerging visions of global empire. There are a number of people who would say, yeah, this has always been kind of like in a global meme, somehow, some way, usually centered in Europe. And certainly, as we realize, definitely through the 20th century and the further we get to this very day. Tell me, if you will, what happened first? That you encountered this literature at one time, perhaps, and then said, you know what, this is telling me something about what's going on today? Or did you look backwards just because of what's happening? How did that work out?
Well, it was almost a fluke that the issue of poetry came up in terms of looking at the history behind what we call the New World Order and things of that ilk. I have a good bit of a background in literature, an academic background. I've gone down a very different path in life since then. But there's a time in my life when I was really immersed in poetry and other literary forms.
Weren't we all?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay.
But what crossed my mind, when I was in junior high, what older folks like me experienced instead of what they now call middle school, one of the poems that made one of the most vivid and earliest impressions on me was called The End of the World by Archibald MacLeish. And when we move forward in history in this segment, if you will, we'll probably be taking a look at that poem. Okay. But I happen to be thinking about that poem and about MacLeish and some of his other poems and his history external to his poetry because he was very politically involved. He was an undersecretary of state. He was Librarian of Congress. He was sort of a propagandist for the War Information Bureau under Roosevelt. And thinking about that context, and he was also associated with a lot of the figures who evolved what we now call the national security state, mm-hmm. and Dean Acheson and the Dulles brothers and people of that ilk. And thinking about that context and looking at some of the imagery of his poetry, it just struck me that there were some really fascistic strains, and particularly something that I hadn't really caught on to, sort of an elitist kind of stance in how he looked at the common people or at American society at the times that he was writing, roughly, and I don't know, roughly from the 30s to the 50s. We'll go into that detail on that when we get there. So I was thinking about that, and that's what kind of prompted me to contact you and suggest that looking at New World Order sorts of issues through the lens of poetry might be a worthwhile series, and I had suggested a guest for that, and you felt that might not quite work out, and instead invited me on. So I won't say anything more specific about that.
No, but it's one of those cases. Right? It's your idea. Well, guess what? You're going to do it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But I have to admit, okay. I mean, everybody can probably relate to what you're saying. It's interesting because once you have an understanding that there is a structure, however nebulous it may be, that has sought global empire, not necessarily through militarism, but just kind of behind the scenes and knows how to get things done. But then you realize that there have been footprints headed in that direction. that go back quite a way. I mean, you could argue that it goes back to Rome, but I mean, in this case, here you have, and I think this is what you're going to open up with, a very new country that immediately is federated under a central government, and of course there's a lot of colonists now, state residents, who are like, oh, wait a second, and so the battle begins. What was this all about? Was this somewhat of a, shall we say, an early trial run, a practice game, if you will, about a bigger federation that might come later on? Who knows? But here you are, and I'll let you continue that story also if you want to, because we're going to go back to, I guess, the late 18th century to begin this. But by all means, if you want to fill in some more before we get to it, by all means, go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's the gist of how poetry emerged as a topic to look at, or as a lens to look at this material through. But after thinking about it some more, and as you and I exchanged emails, I happened to mention in particular that I had previously run across indications that, you know, there's a deep history of sort of a conspiracy narrative dating back in our country from at least the period right after the Revolution. And I specifically made reference to Jedediah Morse, and I think that's what planted the seed of making this into a multi-part series that would kind of go chronologically through poetry as it kind of lines up with American history, and see what we might find, you know, even going back this far and kind of working our way up to the 20th century issues that initially gave me the idea.
I want to also mention at this time, although it'll be evident by anybody who goes to the audio because the directions will be there, that there are the excerpts to which you're speaking and probably which you'll read will be available for anyone to call up, so that if you do want to read along, which kind of makes sense, although it's been quite a long time before all of us read in class together, but you can do that, or you can reflect upon it later on if you so choose, but it's available right now. So if this is the time that you should go to one of the first selections, by all means do it, and it's the first one that will be listed there. And can I say that, though this is not poetry, I think what you're doing is laying down a baseline of a certain sentiment that was there in the United States that spoke of secret societies and powers beyond the borders of the very new United States.
Yes, and I'll also add that in talking about Jedediah Morse, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in history to what we're going to be looking at subsequently, because just Morse is such a vivid way of framing up the idea that there was this angst about the direction of the country and whether we needed a strong federal government, and a conspiracy narrative and concern about the role of secret societies working itself into that sense of angst in a very vivid way.
Before you get into it, let me ask you personally, did you think he was a Looney Tune, or do you think he was onto something?
I think he believed, at the very least, he believed he was onto something. I don't think he was a Looney Tune. My sense of that is more or less intuitive just from reading his writing and just, I mean, look, he was a prominent figure. He was a well-known geographer. He was a pastor. He published a number of books on geography of North America that became, you know, very seminal texts. So, I mean, I think he had, at least in that sense, all his marbles. So, someone can be very gifted and still be paranoid schizophrenic, of course. We can't know that for sure, but I believe that he thought he was onto something. I don't have specifics on this, but if you look at, like, you know, Cliff Notes and Wikipedia versions of his history, you will encounter assertions that some of the sources who fed him information about secret societies were later discredited. But again, I can't say anything really firm about that one way or another without some additional research.
He does remind me of those who have tried to warn, and there's dozens of them through history. Some are looked at probably as being well-intentioned, and then something went wrong. You know, when he says, I have a list here, Jedediah Morse says this in the sermon from which you're going to read. It reminds you of McCarthy, and of course that's not a good visual. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily make you wrong, and there really is an enigma to all of this. It's the story of somebody who may be right, and maybe the powers that be don't like it, and they demonize and marginalize the individual. Only time will tell, but in this case, the argument is still there, and the decision, the school is still out on that. Although, and I think this isn't really where it should be decided, but of course, Freemasons can't stand them to this day. But I'm not so sure, that it was the Freemasons he was throwing stuff at, but we'll find out. And you're going to lead us through that.
Right, and another thing to point out here before I get into the passage, I think, is that he is purportedly coming at this secret society and conspiracy narrative from a Federalist perspective. And in the sermon we're looking at, this is like 1799, after the ratification of the Constitution, and I guess Adams would have been president. And he's definitely with the program that was set up with the Constitution, and I think that's counter to what some of us who look at the Federalists versus Anti-Federalist debate, at least in terms of what we'd see in the Anti-Federalist papers, it would be counter to what we might expect as someone who is supporting the regime, making these accusations about secret societies and conspiracies. So that's really noteworthy, I think.
I was surprised, and I won't delay this any longer, but I was surprised because you believe in the salvation through Jesus Christ as well as I do. And these days, I'm thinking that probably what Christ was telling us, now we're dealing with a New Testament covenant, was that it's like, look, don't get involved in politics. The name of the game is share the gospel, alleviate suffering, feed the hungry, and let that be the case because this is not your world. And yet we do see Morse get in there and start swinging it out, but it almost seems at times that it's contradictory. That's the way things are, and this guy apparently was a firebrand and used the pulpit as a platform from which he made certain polemic statements.
Yeah, and before we get into it, just briefly, I'd say that what you say about the contradictions is on point with your comparison to McCarthy, because my take on McCarthy is that he at least had some of it right.
Yep.
But as I think you've implied on some of your past shows, is that he himself was probably manipulated or deceived in various ways, even though he may have had part of the picture right.
Exactly, with McCarthy, and as you have heard me say, as a young child, I was pro-McCarthy, and I thought he sucked, and I thought it was okay. Now I think the point was that he was given a lot of rope to go do certain things. He didn't realize he was being used and set up in that final, very dramatic episode with Welch, the lawyer. And I think that's what they did. They let him go and do certain things, and then they crushed him. And, of course, everybody forgot about communism for a while. But, yeah, I think his intentions were good. I think also he probably allowed vanity to get to him a little bit. But, again, you have a very flamboyant figure who was willing to get out there. I can assume we have an individual like Morse who, being a preacher, probably had greater prestige than we hold him in these days. So, yeah, okay, no more about McCarthy, but yes, that's another interesting thing. But when you start talking about lists I have here, you better produce them and tell folks how you got that information. So
exactly, yeah. So would it make sense to give a little bit of a biographical background to kind of frame things up?
For who? Old Jedediah?
For Jedediah Morse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. He lived from 1761 to 1826. He earned a Master's of Divinity from Yale in 1786. He served as a pastor, as I mentioned, but also worked as a teacher, writer, and geographer. And very interestingly, he was as we've spoken about, he was the father of Samuel Morse, who, among many other things, invented the telegraph and the Morse code, and he did that apparently in association with Theodore Vail, who was the founder of AT&T. So you see, beginnings of some very elite connections with the worlds of media and culture and communications very early on.
Absolutely.
So Jedediah was considered a Federalist, and he as we'll see in this passage, accused anti-federalists of having ties to an Illuminati conspiracy that he also alleged was behind the French Revolution, and which in today's terms would probably be described as more leftist in nature than the American Revolution. So, in other words, he was accusing the anti-federalists of being involved in a leftist conspiracy, if you will. So the book we're going to take a look at is a sermon exhibiting the present dangers and consequent duties of citizens of the United States of America, delivered at Charlestown, Virginia, April 25th, 1799. That's quite a mouthful of a title there. But again, this is about 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution occurred to form a stronger federal government.
Okay.
So if you're ready at this point, we'll just zero in on an excerpt from pages 16 through 18.
Okay.
Right. It has long been suspected that secret societies, under the influence and direction of France, holding principles subversive of our religion and government, existed somewhere in this country. This suspicion was cautiously suggested from this desk on the day of the last national fast with a view to excite a just alarm and to put you on your guard against their secret artifices. Evidence that this suspicion was well-founded has since been accumulating, and I have now in my possession complete and indubitable proof that such societies do exist and have for many years existed in the United States. I have, my brethren, an official authenticated list of names, ages, places of nativity, professions, etc., of the officers and members of a society of Illuminati, or as they are now more generally and properly styled, Illuminates, consisting of 100 members instituted in Virginia by the Grand Orient of France. This society has a deputy whose name is on the list, who resides at the Mother Society in France, to communicate from thence all needful information and instruction. The date of their institution is 1786, before which period it appears from the private papers of the European societies already published, according to Professor Robeson, that several societies had been established in America. The seal and motto of this society correspond with their detestable principles and designs. The members are chiefly immigrants from France and Santo Domingo, with the addition of a few Americans, and from almost all the nations of Europe. A letter which enclosed this list, an authentic copy of which I also possess, contains evidence of the existence of a society of like nature and probably more ancient date at New York, out of which have sprung 14 others scattered we know not where over the United States. 2 societies of the same kind, but of an inferior order, have been instituted by the society first mentioned, once in Virginia and the other at Santo Domingo. How many of equal rank they have established among us, I am not informed. You will perceive, my brethren, from this concise statement of facts, that we have in truth secret enemies, not a few, scattered through our country. How many, and except in 3 or 4 instances, in what places we know not, enemies whose professed design is to subvert and overturn our holy religion and our free and excellent government. And the pernicious fruits of their insidious and secret efforts must be visible to every eye, not obstinately closed or blinded by prejudice. Among these fruits may be reckoned our unhappy and threatening political divisions, the unceasing abuse of our wise and faithful rulers, the virulent opposition to some of the laws of our country and the measures of the supreme executive, the Pennsylvania insurrection, the industrious circulation of baneful and corrupting books, and the consequent wonderful spread of infidelity, impiety, and immorality, the arts made use of to revive ancient prejudices. And I kind of made a transcription error with this next word, so I'll just skip over it. In party spirit, by concealing or disguising the truth and propagating falsehoods. And lastly, the apparently systematic endeavors made to destroy not only the influence and support, the official existence clergy.
What do you have back where you said there was a transcription error? Because if I took this off his speech, and the verb seemed to be cherish.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. There was one of those old-fashioned
there was
F's
an F,
from a long S
mm-hmm.
that I didn't fix. Basically, so it's probably in our cherished virtues or something to that effect.
And but that particular, not to dwell on this, but I found that it's funny that you kind of like stumbled upon that, not only because of that particular affectation that they used in those days, but because I don't know what they mean in a sense, and cherish party spirit. Are we talking a party are we talking about Republican and Democrat, or are we talking about, Bacchanalia?
Yeah, that's hard to know because
Right.
he's also talking about, talking negatively about the divisions that are emerging, which, presumably could refer to political parties. So I wouldn't know if you would be referring there to the Federalist Party, or because of changing idioms, that could be something entirely different at this point.
All right. Now, first of all, and I'm not going to get into my entrenched beliefs, as you're well aware of, but are you okay with the fact that he's referring to Freemasonry, or do you think it's something else?
I mean, if I understand your question correctly, I would say I'd have to do some more research to substantiate that. But as I alluded to earlier, I think it's a little bit unexpected that someone who was supporting the new federal regime would be raising that concern about Freemasons and Illuminati and so on. And there's a couple of potential implications of that, because I think we know that this whole narrative of the secret societies and Freemasons and so on has been played by both sides, if you will, at various times through history when it's been opportune to support the cause of any particular interest group.
Well, in the beginning, in that second paragraph, he refers, well, actually it's not the second paragraph, it's a place where I have a break, but it talks about and members of a society of Illuminati, and then in the parentheses it said, or as they are now generally properly styled, Illuminis, consisting of 100 members instituted in Virginia by the Grand Orient of France. Now, I think that when you hear Grand Orient of France, it usually is attached very firmly to Freemasonry. On the other hand, you had French Freemasonry being very involved in, if you will, building some of the edifices in D.C. The whole place was constructed by a French Mason, Lafont. But then he talks about, and we've talked a little bit about this, and I think it's a name that's been bandied about a whole lot and has really lost exactly the specific, group or people it refers to, and that is, the Illuminati. To this day we're talking about, the Illuminati. To me, that sometimes becomes a catchphrase for anything that is considered shadowy, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So what I'm throwing out is that when you look at a pivotal figure like Weishaupt, and you look at him, and you've got an involvement with him in Ingolstadt, and was he the head of something that died out? Was it something that turned into some kind of Jesuit influence? Was it something that, turned into a Templar influence? To me, the trail grows cold when he leaves the scene, more or less, and this Bavarian Illuminati, where does it go? And there's a whole lot of theories about where it takes place. And so before I go any further, I just want to ask you, have you ever made any sense about what the Illuminati was? And is there an is to this? Is there an Illuminati today? What do you think?
If I were to hazard to guess, I would say that I agree with you that the official organization died with Weishaupt, but the influence of their ways of thinking, their philosophies, may have continued or kind of dispersed their way into other
organizations.
Other groups. Yeah, other organizations, other groups, people with like frames of mind, if you will. I think it's easy to get overly simplistic about these things, and to look at what we deal with in shows like yours as one big monolithic conspiracy. And I think that can be, a diversion in some ways. And I think also, the Joe Pesci line comes to mind as the enigma. The mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma. Drawing conclusions is difficult, but I think that, if you use words like the elite, the Illuminati, etc., it can also just be a way of describing, in a simple way, a simplified way of describing powerful groups and factions who also may, to various extents, be in competition with one another and at other levels in cahoots with one another, if that addresses your question.
Yeah, when you look back to Germany, it sprang many, I guess you could call quasi-secret societies or organizations. And we spoke about that there is what is considered the true Rosicrucian Center in Pennsylvania, which draws back to its center in Germany. They want themselves to be understood that they are different from any of the other Rosicrucian outfits in the United States. The other one that seems to be the next largest would be that which is in, I think, San Jose or whatever. It's in California. But Germany's an interesting place. Then later on you have the Thule Society and everything else. So a lot of stuff came out of there. And then you can get lost in the sauce with all this kind of stuff. But the bottom line is he's concerned about, shall we say, would you be willing to say that there's a foreign influence behind these organizations, and he feels that the Republic is at risk?
Yeah, that certainly sounds like a good synopsis of his concern. Whether it's a valid concern or not, or whether he may have an agenda, are other questions that, again, would probably really need further research to really make sense out of it.
The only thing I took note of was the fact that he was at least adamant about stating that apparently the locales that were hotbeds was the state of Virginia, and I guess the Caribbean island of St. Domingo. That's what I get from that.
Well, and that raises another interesting issue, because later when we look at Freneau, one of the accusations leveled at him by George Washington was that he was, and it's clear that Freneau was an admirer of the French Revolution, but the accusation was thrown at him that he had formed the Jacobin societies in the United States, which were extensions of the Jacobin movement in France, which clearly was behind the French Revolution. And by all appearances, that's entirely true, and Philip Freneau, who we'll look at later, wouldn't deny that, probably, that he had participated in the formation of Jacobin clubs. So there's that level of influence that I think can be easily documented.
Yeah. Boy, I tell you what, it was a very interesting time. And we as Americans, and rightfully so, were very much attuned to what was going on here, although a lot of folks, I think, probably are kind of vague about what happened in the years between the end of the Revolution and the War of 1812. But in a way, you could say that Britain kind of couldn't go on with this kind of thing happening in America because they had troubles over the pond, and we kind of don't really consider that. And yet that was probably as much of an influence on what happened here than anything else. And the reason I say that is because after you finish the excerpt, later on, he also makes mention of Holland and problems there in a Protestant country. And then later on, I think we also encounter in one of the poems that we may get to today, an inclusion of the problems that there are with Holland and France. You remember that? We're gonna come upon that. I don't know how quickly.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's definitely a key issue. Is the issue of foreign debt in particular, and North America was really a hot mess of colonial ventures by a variety of countries, and I think it's easy for us to forget about that from our perspective all these years later. But again, you have this issue of the joint stock companies. When we're talking about foreign debt, I think it's quite conceivable that these are obligations that the original investors, if you will, felt that they were owed, even though we had supposedly won our independence. And there's even reference, I believe, in the Treaty of Paris to the debt that the Americans still owe, I think, to Holland in particular.
Yeah, I'm rustling papers here, but I'm looking forward to where we're also going to go. We may touch upon that, but I guess the point is that folks think about wars and they don't think about prices. We don't talk about debts that are owed. Well, we do nowadays, but nobody seems to pay any, so who cares? But back then,
right.
Hey, you got to pay up, and there's things to be done, and you can't overlook them. And yet, history kind of doesn't touch upon that because it's so infatuated with this whole war for freedom and such. But boy, there was a whole lot of, I guess, entangling alliances and financial considerations after the fact, and we're probably going to head in that direction soon. So I'm going to throw it back to you and tell us. Well, first of all, any comments you want to make with regard to what we just did, and take us to where we're going to go.
I would say that I think we've really hit the key points. I think my primary initial reaction to it was that, again, it's not what I mean. Look, people who look at the Federalist and anti-Federalist debate from the perspective of not liking the powerful state that we have today might have too much of a tendency to want to put black hats on the Federalists and white hats on the anti-Federalists, if you will. But if you look at something like this, I think this passage that we just read, I think it shows you at least the picture is a lot murkier, and that to a certain extent it's at our peril that we draw conclusions too quickly.
Exactly, and well, it like you said, it's definitely murky, and I sit here. It could take hours to go through this and try to figure out who's speaking truthfully and who's not and who's got agendas. But this is a wild time that unfortunately gets glossed over in the whole, okay, the revolution, we had freedom, blah, blah, blah. But things go on. The political machines continue. And unfortunately, people think that all of a sudden the new United States, or whatever they wanted to be called, kind of lived off in a vacuum. But no, there were a lot of attachments still to Europe. And those are kind of forgotten about, and boy, they certainly shouldn't be. And I think this kind of evinces those kind of attachments that people are not aware of. Europe had its eyes on us, and every one of those nations there probably had a different feeling toward us. You can imagine what Britain felt when France went to our side. It's like, oh yeah? And it goes on and on and on. Having said that, and I guess kind of foreshadowing what you're going to go to, what are you going to hit next?
I'd hit a group of poets called the Hartford Wits, who are, again, characterized as Federalist poets, who had a pretty clear and strong agenda in support of getting the Constitution ratified, which was something that was really in process during the years they were writing probably their best-known poem, which is called the Anarchiad. So for some background on the Hartford Wits, it was a group of poets that began as a literary society at Yale University.
Once again,
best known.
It's always Yale, isn't it? It's always Yale. Morse was at Yale. Everybody was at Yale.
Yeah, which is, interesting in itself. It's particularly when you see it's these Federalist figures who are coming out of Yale. And incidentally, I found out, just a side note, Archibald MacLeish, who was pivotal in the conceptualization of this series, was apparently a Skull and Bones member himself.
There you go.
More interesting things to look at. But the Anarchiad was published serially in 1786 and 1787. And I just had a note here that, the Yale connection might, raise immediate suspicion, but you have to note that the Skull and Bones Society, at least, did not form until 1832, although there were predecessor societies that again, that would be a whole other historical research project there. But the Wits consisted of it was 4 poets, David Humphreys, who lived from 1752 to 1818. And he was also a colonel in the American Revolution, and he was an aide-de-camp to George Washington. And later, and I guess this was still during the Articles of Confederation period, he was a minister to Portugal and Spain. I think they were called ministers during that period before we had ambassadors, per se.
But JQ, let me ask you, does that mean he was a minister from a particular state, since that was the point that all states had or wanted to have their own dealings with other nations? Was he affiliated necessarily with any state, or was there a more of a national import to his ministerialship, if you will?
I would presume it would have been national. I'm not certain about that, but I would line that up with other precedents, such as this is something we might touch on a bit later, that John Adams, during the Articles of Confederation period, was Secretary of State. No. He served as ambassador to the Court of St. James, actually, during the period before the ratification of the Constitution.
Do you know what other, I guess you could say, luminous figure also served in that post? Many.
Who?
Joseph Kennedy.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Probably a coincidence. Yeah, all right.
But he was apparently Adams was the first in that role of
that long line. Okay.
So my point there is that even though the states were more like what we would look at as a confederation of small countries, there still was some level of national presence in terms of diplomacy, right? Gotcha. So, and again, and that's, I think, another interesting topic in itself. How did they define that national body? I mean, I guess an ambassador or a minister or a secretary of state would have been, I guess, under the auspices of the Congress, I suppose, which was really the loose federal governing body at that time.
Yeah, right.
So,
who else are some of the characters in that group?
Okay, so there's Joel Barlow, who lived from 1754 to 1812, and he was also the author of The Vision of Columbus and The Hasty Pudding. And interestingly, he also wrote something called The Conspiracy of Kings, which is a poem addressed to the inhabitants of Europe from another quarter. Well, actually, this is a subtitle. Conspiracy of Kings, a poem addressed to the inhabitants of Europe from another quarter of the globe. And that was in 1792.
Let me ask you this. And excuse me, I'm sorry for stepping on you, but I just got to get this in real quick. People can hear Hasty Pudding, and their ears are going to go up. Because I think you would say that the collaborators in this particular work were, in a sense, doing some things tongue-in-cheek. Do you think that Hasty Pudding came from this, that these guys were the beginning of satirism in politics?
Well, it's clear that this is a satirical poem, and I think they were overtly working in the tradition of Alexander Pope. And in fact, there's a lot of prose commentary that they intersperse between their sections of verse, as you've probably noted. And one of the comments was that it was definitely tongue-in-cheek, was that they accused Alexander Pope of plagiarizing some of their couplets, which was probably the exact reverse was true. I'm sure they were really ripping off Alexander Pope big time. But yeah, and that was just a big part of the whole. They were a little bit behind the times, I guess, because in England, William Blake was active by this time. So in hearkening back to Pope, they were probably, behind the avant-garde, if you will. But yeah, to your point, there definitely is a tongue-in-cheek aspect to what they're doing.
So Hasty Pudding, as we know it now, might have sprung from this very group.
Well, I'm not entirely clear on that because I'd have to check into that because my initial association when I hear Hasty Pudding is Benjamin Franklin, but I could be mistaken.
Oh no, there's a roast kind of where they go ahead and they lampoon somebody, and I think it's called the Hasty Pudding Club, and that's what I was thinking about because I gotta believe that it goes back to these characters who, in a way, I guess you could say, were a literary Second City or Saturday Night Live in a sense.
Yeah, and they started as a literary society at Yale, actually. So, yeah, that's very true. There was definitely satirical and humorous elements to it.
Are there four of them, and did you hit all four, or are we missing somebody?
No, I had stopped at Barlow, who is the second on the list here, and
Okay.
and I think it's also interesting that one of his later works also was called A View of the Public Debt, Recipients and Expenditure of the United States, published in 1800. And then, according at least to the Wikipedia version of the history of the wits, Barlow eventually repudiated federalism, which again is interesting in view of some of the titles we just looked at, Conspiracy of Kings and View of the Public Debt.
If I could, before we get into this, because I think it has to be viewed in the sense that they meant it. So we have people here with pretty acerbic wits, intelligent and certainly gifted, but we have to look that there might be a little bit of Monty Python going on here. I would also mention this. We're taking this from the 1861 edition of the Anarchiad, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered if that release, now remember that New England too was pretty much a staunch abolitionist section in the North. Could you, and I mean this may be outside your purview, but I just think it's worth bringing up, that the timing of the 1861 edition, with obviously the Civil War happening, do you think that with this heavy Federalist tinge, because even though there may be lampooning going on here, they still, I believe, were Federalists, would you might think that this release might have been something to at least, shall we say, intellectually buoy the folks in the North for what's going to be a pretty nasty affair?
I'd say that that's at least a good hypothesis there, because I think the subject matter in terms of making the case for federal power is absolutely germane to what was happening in that period. So I would say, yeah, that's an important angle to look at there.
I'd just say that, yes, even though they may be joking somewhat throughout what we're going to hear in the time that we have left, and we'll pick it up again in the second segment, that by all means that they were Federalists and they felt that the federal government should be inviolable and upheld, but that message must certainly have resonated with the North as they were going to embark on a 4-year period of carnage.
Absolutely, and I would add that, I think the humor and satire is in the form of presentation, but I couldn't reach any other conclusion that they're, deadly serious about their content and what they're making a case for.
All right, so do you feel that in this, and we definitely, I don't want to stop you from getting into this before we go, but it just, we can't set this up a second time. Do you believe that some of this, although I would consider it almost kind of like a contemporaneously overblown, because things were so much literary then, I mean, as you went back in time, the prose just flowed and all. But do you believe that some of this was pretty much a put-on?
Well, a put-on from which perspective, in terms of the subject matter they were dealing with, or the form? I guess I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, and fair enough. To me, it seemed that either they were really waving the bloody flag, or they were making a point, but they kind of overloaded it, and then that they were all having a chuckle about it. Because what you're going to read, I mean, if you're going to take it seriously down the road, it'd be like, whoa, man, is this propaganda? But if you look at it with them, perhaps with a bit of a wink, and an elbow in your ribs, you can understand that, well, they're serious, but they're overplaying it for the effect.
There might be a couple of different layers to that issue,
certainly,
actually, because there's a section in the preface to this 1861 edition that I want to hit on that suggests that the readership of the time took a lot of it quite literally. actually, especially in terms of the backstory behind, the supposed discovery of this poetic work. So I think that's a very pertinent question, and if they felt that, I think there is a good case to be made for a strong tradition of naivety in the rank and file of the American public, and to a certain extent, these guys might have been doing something sort of double-edged or forked-tongued in terms of exploiting that naivety of their readership to a certain extent, while also advancing a real agenda that they supported.
All right, folks, don't get frustrated with me for stopping JQ, but you got to understand, you're going to have to assume a certain mindset, because once he gets rolling with this, you'll understand why. So I'll throw it back to you, whatever you want to do from this point on, if you want to get into either the preface or into some of the later writings, which are on page 6 and such. So take it away.
Yeah, I think the preface is really too interesting to dismiss. So real quickly, though, back to the authors, I don't have biographical information on the last two, so I'll just quickly reiterate. It's 4 authors, and there are Humphreys, Barlow, Trumbull, and then Dr. Lemuel Hopkins. So the Anarchiad is a satirical epic poem directed against opponents of a strong federal government, published serially in the New Haven Gazette and Connecticut Magazine, 1786 and 1787. And as we mentioned, the first book form was 1861, edited by Luther G. Riggs, and that's the text I'm reading from. And again, I think some of the material in the preface is at least as revealing as the poem itself, so I'll share an excerpt of that, and that's from Roman numeral pages 6 and 7. So here we go. The Anarchiad is a mock critical account of a pretended ancient epic poem with a member of a society of critics and antiquarians who had accidentally found among some recently discovered ruins, embedded with utensils more curious and elegant than those of Palmyra or Herculaneum, and whose preservation through such a long lapse of years amid marks of hostility and devastation was indeed little short of miraculous. The author assumes to have taken possession of this poem in the name and for the use of the society of which he was a component part. Being passionately fond of poetry, he immediately set about cleansing it from the extraneous concretions in which it was enveloped, and by means of a chemic preparation made use of in restoring oil paintings, he soon succeeded in rendering it tolerably legible. It was then that he ascertained the production to be styled the Anarchiad, a poem on the restoration of chaos and substantial night. In other words, so the anarchy and chaos is purported in this poem as what the result would be if we don't form this strong federal government.
Right.
Now, I'll go on in the preface a bit. When this fabulous announcement was first made to the print of the Gazette, or made in the print of the Gazette, it was received with a remarkable degree of credulity by many readers. The plan was well conceived, and the details relating to it were narrated in a plausible manner. And upon the whole, it was not half as absurd as the celebrated moon hoax perpetrated by the New York Sun newspaper many years afterwards, and readily believed by multitudes in all parts of the country. So apparently someone was a little bit ahead of H.G. Wells and Orson Welles in developing moon hoaxes and perpetuating them through the media.
That's great. Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so besides public attention, but a few months previous to the announcement of the exhuming of the Anarchiad had been somewhat aroused by the discovery of several ruined Indian fortifications with their singular relics, the story of the early emigration of a band of Britons and Welsh to this country and of an existing tribe of their descendants in the interior of the continent had also quite recently been revived and circulated. So a good deal to comment about probably about that preface. I mean, do you have any reactions there?
Well, I will tell you that it was helpful, honestly, because I went backwards on this. I started reading some of the the lines from the body of the Anarchiad, and I'm like, I don't like these guys, but that doesn't matter. But when I go back, and I did not read the preface first because I'm one of those people that now jump ahead, and I said, okay, it says it's a mock critical account. I'm like, all right, slow down, Biz. So anyway, no, that did frame it, and that's why I wanted you to do it, because when we get into these verses, I mean, it flies fast, and you have to understand where they're coming from. So no, and in fact, even the title, the Anarchiad, wasn't that kind of also a little like elbow in the ribs to, what would that be, like the classical works, the Iliad or something like that?
Yeah, I would say so. And then most specifically, I mentioned Pope earlier, but probably Alexander Pope's best-known work is the Dunciad, and I think they were definitely riffing on Pope with that title. All right, so I wanted to pause for a moment and just run through a few quick comments on the excerpt from the preface. We're told that many of the American newspaper readers believed the story of how the group found an ancient American manuscript, even though this affectation was a deep-rooted poetic convention that Alexander Pope in Britain was already satirizing earlier in the 18th century. Yet, if you look back at the credulity and naivety of the readership, it makes me think of it as an account that's similar to what, in the 19th century, the account we're given of Joseph Smith and his discovery of the golden plates containing the manuscripts of the Book of Mormon, which many Americans believe as well. And the reference to the New York Sun moon hoax, I think, is really also fascinating. And a quick rundown of what that was all about. It was a series of articles published in the New York Sun in 1835, and it gave a false account of an astronomer's discovery of life and civilization on the moon. So when we look at Rigg's preface from 1861 talking about the gullible reception of the Anarchiad in the 1780s and the moon hoax in the 1830s, we're apparently seeing the roots of a well-established history of the use of the supposed news media to dupe and manipulate a gullible American public, or a public that the more elite segments of society thought of as gullible. Who knows, maybe they even thought of them as useless eaters by that time.
Well, think about it. I mean, today, if you still have people saying, well, it's in the news, it must be true. I mean, what do you think happened with those folks when all they had at that time was print? Yeah, tremendous. Even though you alluded to before the level of literacy that's apparent, and just the fact that there was a consuming public able to read material that was written in that level, and that poetry, literary works were commonplace to be published in newspapers. So the things that people consumed at that time as popular entertainment bespeaks a pretty good level of literacy and education, even though they weren't educated. Most of them weren't educated in the sense that we think of education today. And that's why they had a good education.
Right, and so I wanted to hit on another passage that suggests the use of fear-mongering after the revolution to justify the need for a stronger federal government. And that's a theme that you'll see when we get into the poem as well. So here's that passage. The Anarchiad is a preeminently a New England poem. Its publication at a time when New England was convulsed by the evils growing out of the war of our revolution, and when insurrectionary mobs had arisen in various parts of the land, and fears were entertained of their proceedings being imitated in the others at such a time, this fearless satire being scattered broadcast into the homes of people through the columns of the weekly press is supposed to have exerted great and beneficial influence upon the public mind, and to have tended in no small degree to check the leaders of insubordination and infidel philosophy. So I think that speaks pretty clearly to the question you were posing earlier about the agenda behind the release of this work in 1861.
All right. So, in sum, as we're running out of time, as it refers back to the release of this edition of the Anarchiad, you would agree now, I think, by what was posted there by Riggs, that it was certainly to, I guess, bolster the North's belief that the Union should not be obviously, riven but kept together.
I think at this point that's a pretty good inference there. I had thought a little bit about the timing of that release being close to the Civil War, but I think you really nailed something there on that point. Well,
I'll tell you, we're going to go immediately to part 2, and so we won't keep your listeners, in abeyance any longer. But this is a part of history that is so full, just chock full of all kinds of intrigues and people just trying to get it right. Let's face it. I'm not going to say everything was Saturnine as far as what was going on, but this is an amazing time, and you hit it right on the head. So I'll give you the outro comments, but you've done a great setup, and I think it was necessary for the text that we're going to cover in the subsequent episodes.
Well, I appreciate that, Al, and I agree with you. In fact, I might even go further to say that this might just be the most important period of American history to be taking a look at with a very close look at with fresh eyes today, because in ways we may not realize, we may be still living with the consequences of how things played out during that period.
Well, it's true. There's nothing more important to anything that grows than its roots and its source. So, yeah, you're right in that sense. We've been with JQ. We're talking about what he had mentioned before, which is something you probably haven't thought too much about, but he's at least coined it in this title, and that is Poetic Perplexities, Emerging Visions of Global Empire. And that's it with a question mark, and I think he's given us the answers. So we'll go on to part 2, and thanks very much for being with us, JQ.
Thanks for having me, Al.